Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our Fireside chat. My name is Josh Woodruff. I'm the founder and CEO of Massive Scale Consulting, also a member of the Cloud Security Alliance Zero Trust Working Group. Have the pleasure of chatting with John Kindervag here, the de
Oh,
facto godfather of Zero Trust.
let's pick up Kindervag. Vog.
Kindervag.
It's
Thank you.
supposed to have two A's in it, but when my grandfather got to Ellis Island, they told him he didn't know how to spell, so they took one of them out.
Thank you for that. I've always said it wrong.
That's okay. I
Now I
only
won't.
correct people when it's like a recording. So
Perfect. Great. Um, So I have the pleasure of chatting with John Kindervag here, the godfather of Zero Trust, about a recent paper that our Zero Trust Working Group published, Zero Trust Guidance for Critical Infrastructure, specifically focused on operational technology and industrial control systems, OT and ICS. John, welcome. So glad to chat with you here.
hey, Josh, great to be talking with you again today.
Thanks, John. I'm eager for the audience to hear your take on what we've written here. I know you participate in the Zero Trust Working Group, so your 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 fingerprints are all over this. But would love to hear folks have folks hear directly from you on some of the topics that we cover in this paper. What we've got up here on this slide is kind of a breakdown of the paper. We've broken up in eight areas. The paper really starts with just defining zero trust. We talk about the five-step zero trust implementation process that John himself authored. I think the first time anybody really saw that was in the NSTAC report to the president. Is that right, John, or was that out before then?
That was out before then, but it's most notable as part of the NSTAC. But I was doing webinars and stuff on that. That happened in 2016, so a couple of years before that. And I was always using it as my uh, my process of buildings and designing zero trust environments.
Got it. Yeah, I think it's such great guidance that we'll get into here, but we spend a bit of time in the paper explaining it. And for those of you following Cloud Security Alliance Zero Trust Working Group in general, we're actually publishing separate papers, one for each of the five steps, because we feel it's such a great way to implement zero trust. In this paper, we cover all five steps. We first define it, then we define critical infrastructure sectors globally, as well as within the United States, the 16 from CISA. We talk about unique challenges in securing critical infrastructure, the threat vectors, the convergence of OT and IT that continues to grow, driven primarily by digital transformation, some of the differences between OT and IT in both objectives as well as technology. And then the bulk of the paper, or really the second half of the paper, is about zero trust implementation for OT and ICS, in which we apply those five steps to an OT and ICS environment. And again, this paper covers all five steps. There will be individual papers. I think we've released two. We're going to release the third soon. So look to Cloud Security Alliance Zero Trust Working Group and the Zero Trust Advancement Center for individual papers on each of the five steps. But what you'll find in this one is all five steps as they apply to OT and ICS. Great. I'm very excited to talk to you about this, John. I'd say first we define zero trust in our paper and we start to talk about what that means. We've mentioned the five steps. Maybe we could kind of stop here for a moment and just talk about this a little bit further. We've mentioned that they first came out in NSTAC report, as John mentioned. He was talking about them before that point. um, Repeatable technology agnostic process that is well suited to incremental and iterative execution. I feel like this is the antidote, John, and I would love to hear from you to folks saying this is too much. This is another forklift upgrade, or even worse, this is a vendor introduced concept that's going to make me buy more stuff. I don't want to touch zero trust. Um, I feel like this is the antidote to that. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean it's phenomenally simple. It's easy to understand. It applies to any environment. It works in the cloud, on premise, or on endpoint. It doesn't care what the DAS element is. I know we'll talk about that in a minute. It just is a simple way to do things, and I'm all about simplicity, especially remember the first 5 or 6 years, I had nobody to help me. I was doing this all on my own, so I was overwhelmed. I got to figure out easy ways to do it. And when I went back and looked at the first 5, 6, 7 zero trust environments that I deployed, I found out that at some level, each of these 5 steps were involved in it every single time. And I've since used it as my mantra. I use it not just in my implementation model, but I use it for planning. I was just with a state government, and they had a 37-page document about their zero trust um, plans. And you couldn't make heads or tails of it. And I kept saying, okay, this paragraph is a step 3 thing, but this paragraph is a step 2 thing, and this one is a step 1 thing, but that one is a step 5. And let's reorganize it in the 5 steps and then put those things underneath it. And when they got done with it, they were, wow, this is so much more readable, right? So it gives you a structure to not just deploy, but to plan. And that's the magic of it. And it's simple, right? Simplicity has a lot of gifts that it can give you.
And simple is not hard. I mean, simple is not easy, it seems. And being simple is actually more difficult than it seems, especially when you have a bunch of engineers.
Well,
Love that. Thank you, John.
getting to simple is hard because people want to make things more complex. I think
Right.
simplicity is, of course, simple, but it's getting through that process, right? Because um, someone called me and said, how come all this new stuff I'm reading is so difficult? And I said, I have no idea. He says, it's so complex. I can't make heads or tails of it. This is an individual who's been doing zero trust for years. And he said, I think people think they sound smarter if they make it more complex. So maybe so. I'm not smart enough to make it more complex. I got to make it simple enough that I can do it. And that's the other thing. Zero trust is something you do, not something you write about. It's not an academic exercise. It is, it is something that you're doing in a data center, or you're connecting to a cloud, or whatever. You do it. You don't just think about it.
Or you do it in a power plant or a windmill farm, right, John? It's not just
Absolutely.
IT. Excellent. Well, and this is what I love about the 5 steps, and I think why Cloud Security Alliance is spending so much time and trying to get guidance out around just the 5 steps in general, and why a lot of our guidance papers are anchored on the 5 steps. It's just it breaks it down to the most simplest steps on how you can get started right now. I really love that. Um, so great. We'll talk about that more as we get through. I think the first, as we proceed in this paper, we start to talk about, well, what are critical infrastructure sectors? We linked to a paper here. It's from 2008, 2009, the International CIIP Handbook. It's quite interesting. There's a link. It's not in the paper, but we link to it, an inventory of 25 national and 7 international critical information protection policies. It's quite interesting. I haven't seen anything of its kind since, but it's a very useful resource to get a more of a global view on critical infrastructure sectors. And of course, we make sure to round that out in the paper to include all 16 that CISA defines within the United States. But there's a lot of them. Critical infrastructure is kind of important. It's the foundation of civilization. It's what keeps us fed and electrified and water flowing and safely. There's so many aspects of it. Even before writing this paper, I kind of took for granted some of these dial tone like facilities. So it was really great to participate in this paper and work with other companies who are providing literally life-saving capabilities they're fundamental to humanity. And the fact that they're coming under attack more and more. I mean, we still are finding things with Salt Typhoon. We still have so many different threats, and they seem to be growing. I feel like there's no better time for this paper to come out because zero trust is the way to secure things in a much more effective manner. And we need to start securing critical infrastructure in a much more effective manner. So there's no better time for this guidance to come out. Okay, great. Well, what I'd like to jump into, John, really is, I think, a big topic that folks talk about is convergence. Uh, the historic air gap, IT separate from OT, I think is rapidly diminished, or maybe it was never there. Depends on who you ask, it seems. Um, this paper's really spent some time talking about the convergence, why air gap isn't really a thing anymore, and why that is. What have you seen, John? I mean, you're working across all kinds of industries and sectors. You think the air gap is still an effective way, or how do you incorporate the notion of air gap within a zero trust strategy?
I haven't seen anything functionally air gapped in almost 20 years. I mean, as soon as the internet came out, everybody wanted to connect all these things to the internet to make it easier to manage. And so air gapping went out the roof. I was telling you, I was working on a project with a big oil company to take asynchronous serial connections, which were generated by SCADA systems, plug them into a Cisco router and figure out how to translate that so that it would then travel back on Ethernet, and then we could execute commands from a head end hundreds of miles away. Well, as soon as you do that, you've just destroyed whatever you thought might have been an air gap, right? But the reality is for the leadership in these organizations, the ability to become more efficient by leveraging the output of digital transformation, which is convergence, was much more compelling than the perceived security they got from air gapping the systems.
Right.
Because air gapping meant if there was a problem, you had to put somebody in a vehicle and drive a couple hundred miles to some oil facility, right? It's incredibly inefficient. And so it was, uh, it solved a lot of problems, but then there's always the law of unintended consequences come out, right? So you're going to, by doing that, you're going to open up yourself up for attack, especially if you're putting it on the public internet with no security controls, which a lot of people did early on, because they didn't think in the security mindset. And so, why would I need a firewall here or whatever? Why would I need to control it? All the people who work for me are good people, and it gets down to this. I trust all these people. Well, yeah, but bad people are going to get in there, and then they're going to look like your people, and you're going to let them do these things, and okay, it's going to be a bad day. So, but there's been a lot of bad days.
That's for sure. Yeah, I think it just makes business sense and responsiveness sense, especially when lives are at stake. Like being able to monitor, respond, and control remotely. Well, of course, you're going to do that. And a lot of these critical infrastructure, I mean, it is a business for the most part. Um, they've got to figure out ways to be efficient. So it just makes perfect sense. So I think this whole notion of air gap is a myth. Things are interconnected. That's a reality that we live in today, and for a lot of different reasons that make perfect sense. So again, applying the zero trust security strategy to critical infrastructure is critical. I think some of the differences we talk about in the paper, we talk about objectives, we talk about technology. I think this is where a lot of folks get caught up in that, oh, well, zero trust is just an IT thing. It's just for digital environments. It doesn't really work in cyber physical environments. There's a lot of confusion, fear, uncertainty, and doubt that zero trust works in cyber physical environments. We speak to that in a number of different ways in the paper. I bring up this slide because talking about differences in technology, um, regardless of what we've got in the slide or what we've got in the paper, What's your response to that, John? What's your take on zero trust working for OT and IT ubiquitously?
Yeah, so when you look at that first point, 53% have outdated OS. Our first thought is to go, oh no, they're not even upgrading, except you're not asking the question of why they're not upgrading. And I can tell you the answer because I've been involved in some of these things. If you have a PLC, for example, or an HMI, it doesn't matter, some controller that is in an OT system, what often happens is that was never designed to be upgradable. And so I can tell you of one major company that I was involved in with zero trust for OT environment, and their big problem was the manufacturing computers that controlled the computer machine, the manufacturing machines, right? They were computer controlled, had outdated OS. They were running Windows XP. And so IT was like, well, upgrade that to Windows 7. This tells you how long ago I did that. And they said, well, the drivers won't support Windows 7. Well, get them to, you know, get them to get new drivers. Well, the company's out of business. We can't. Well, buy new PLCs from somebody else that supports Windows IT. Well, that's or Windows 7. And the leader, it was the senior vice president of manufacturing of this company, he says that's easily $1 billion at the level that we're at. And the IT guy goes, what? So what? Like, how are we going to get that $1 billion back? And he said, that's not my problem. And and the SVP said, well, why don't you and your team leave, and me and John and a couple other people, we're going to design this system for you, and then you're just going to implement it, and then just push them out of the room, because clearly the person didn't understand the business imperative, right? So the first design principle of zero trust is focus on the business outcomes. There's a reason you're doing this, and it's a business reason. And so all of these things, data points out, hanging out there on their own with no context, all are like, whoa, scary, except when you understand the environment that they're coming in, outdated OS, but I can't update it. No automatic antivirus protection. Well, in general, based upon how the systems work, there haven't been viruses for OT generally, right? 40% of industrial sites have at least one direct connection to the internet. I would say, I'll bet that's 100% now, because they have to. How are they going to control those things from a centralized control system? 84% have at least one remotely accessible device. That was the goal. The goal was to create remotely accessible devices, right? And 16% have at least one wireless access point. And that could get worse. I mean, they might have hopping Zigbee access points. If you're out on an oil well, all out in East Texas, Zigbee doesn't have a long, ability to throw a signal very far. So they have various hops. And so there's a lot of problems, and actually using real IT types of technology could solve some of those things. But and then things like plain text passwords, we can solve that in policy. Unique protocols, which we've talked a lot about prior to this call, I don't see that as an issue. It's just protocols we don't use, but they're functional protocols, Modbus or whatever. Those, Modbus talks to PLCs. And just like we have all kinds of weird protocols in our world, that are just as dangerous. SMB is a dangerous protocol. So you just need to control those protocols as traffic is traveling from from some downstream system towards the protect surface. You control, should John be able to access the PLC via Modbus? That's the question you ask. So all these things, I think, are things that are just the motherhood and apple pie of the way this world works, but we can use zero trust methods and ideas to make them not scary.
Love that, John. And I think to recap what you've just run through, yes, these are facts. These are the realities of the world. And I think one of the additional vulnerabilities that results from these no-brainer things happening, like more connectivity, non-upgradable components, is it does create some more risk because as you're interconnecting these systems, we know IT, one of the entire goals of IT is interconnectedness, digital connectivity. Attacks come in through that. They make their way into your OT and then they run laterally. And that's the concern if you've got more vulnerable systems in your OT environment and you're interconnecting them to the highly volatile IT environment, you have higher risk. So really zeroing in on those, seeing what you can do about them, but just starting simple. John just described a scenario where, yeah, maybe it's going to cost $1 billion to do the right thing over time. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't start right now in a very simple way to define some perimeters. And this is where the 5-step comes in. This is where this paper really describes you don't need to wait to spend the $1 billion and upgrade all your PLCs and get all your operating systems updated and have the perfect policies. Just take it one step at a time and do what you start with what you have and start the zero trust journey. That's really one of the key messages of our paper here is yes, there's some things you should probably change over time and they're going to cost money, but it doesn't mean you have to wait. So I also love the concept that John always talks about and just talked about here about simplicity. And if anybody hasn't read Jason Garbus and Jerry Chapman's Zero Trusted Enterprise Guidebook, I highly recommend you do. They say something in the book that really resonates with me that I talk about a lot of zero trust is simple by design. John made it simple by design. He made the 5-step to make it simple by design. And Jason and Jerry describe zero trust as a homogenizing layer of snow atop all of your underlying complexity that enables you to apply uniform policy so that you really can control who's doing what, where, when, how, and why. Um, it's a beautiful thing. You don't need to spend the $1 billion and replace all your PLCs to get started. You can start now. And this paper really is meant to tell you exactly how to do that. Okay, great. Well, let's get into the 5 steps, John. We've got the paper spends the second half of this paper is all about the 5 steps. We'll run through a few brief statements on those 5 steps here. You mentioned DAS elements earlier. What do you mean by that, and how do they relate in an OT environment when we talk about DAS elements and defining the protect surface?
So in the history of zero trust, step one was define your data, because I was really focusing on data security at the time. And then people would come to me, one of the first ones is, hey, I'm in the oil business. I want to protect my SCADA systems on wells in the Gulf of, I guess it's now the Gulf of America, isn't it? But how would I do that? Well, you just do it the same way, but it's not really data, but it uses data. And so you start to get into these things. I'm like, okay, well, that's not going to be a compelling story for these kinds of people. And so I said, what would you call it? He said, I'd call it an asset. Okay, great. So we can use it for assets. And I explained how I would do that. Okay, good. And in fact, we deployed some of these things on these oil rigs in the various Gulfs in the North Sea and stuff. And then what else would we use it for? Well, we use it to secure applications that use sensitive data, because sometimes that's the best way to get a hold of the data, is to secure it while it's traveling inside of an application. And then services are DNS, DHCP, Active Directory, Network Time Protocol, things that are so mission critical that if they go down, your whole system goes down, but you typically don't think about protecting them very much. And so that's how it became a DAS element. It could have been a SAD element, services, assets, applications, and data, but I just didn't think that would resonate as well. So DAS, right? And that, when I first I wrote a blog post about that. And when I first did that, I got so much positive feedback that I realized I was onto something, that people wanted to know, what do I put in here? But they wanted to know it with, a kind of amount of specificity, but without long lists of things, right? 27 pages of things that possibly could go in there. Just give me the overall stuff. So again, trying to make it simple. And then I remember when NSA in their guidance came out with DAS elements. Okay, this has gotten, it's bled into the whole community. So a DAS element is what you put into a protect surface, and you put one DAS element into a protect surface, and you build out your entire zero trust environment one protect surface at a time. So the protect surface is the most important concept in zero trust from a tactical perspective. What are you going to protect? If you don't know the answer to that, you're never going to be successful at protecting anything because you don't know what you're protecting, right? So, and then another thing about a protect surface, once you know what DAS elements are there and how the system works, you can give it what I call a relevance score. And you can stack rank them in terms of priority. So we typically have an R score of 0 to 100, 100 being the most important, right? In terms of criticality, business function, different reasons they might be important. And so you want to make sure that your higher R level protect surfaces have more maturity in them.
Thank you for that explanation, John. It makes perfect sense. And we do our best to define that as well in the paper. I think something else we talk about that extends on what John just mentioned was, and John, I'd love your opinion on this just to openly discuss. I hear a lot of nervousness from OT personnel around, well, I can't put security around a single thing. Like I can't get that fine grained. I'm in a flat network. I've got a collection of systems that all work together. In the step one paper that CSA put out, we defined a business information system as a potential protect surface to start with. In this paper, we talked about potentially an operational system, a collection of assets that has various sets of data in it that you may want to start with as a protect surface. And it might be more than one DAS element because you simply don't have the ability to put a boundary around the small enough thing. And it's perfectly fine to start with a broader set, a collection of DAS elements. And as you proceed and you run through the 5 steps of each protect surface, which we'll get to the other 5, the other 4, you get better at this. And you may want to start as you proceed. We talk a lot about this in the paper. You will naturally start to identify areas where you can get more granular on those protect surfaces. You can truly start to whittle down to a single DAS element in certain cases. In certain cases, you won't be able to. It's the reality of a cyber physical system or plant distributed all over the world.
And
What's your
that's
take on
why,
that, Johnson?
well, that's why step 2 becomes so important, because as soon as you start mapping the transaction flows, you'll see where those systems are, and you'll see where the controls need to be, and you'll see how they work together as a system. And you can kind of see, well, you may have to have what I call nested protect surfaces. So this is the main thing that I want to protect, but because of the way it interacts with other systems, it interacts with system A, B, and C, because I want to get system Z. Just got back from Europe. System Z to be the most important thing, and so Z nests inside of A, B, and C, and so that whole thing and maybe we'll have 2 or 3 different gateway controls, what NIST calls policy enforcement points, what I call segmentation gateways. And the goal here is to just make sure that the right identified user, whether that's a machine or whether that's a human, is accessing that resource via the right protocol at the right time in the right way. And so using the Kipling model, then we can build that conduit that allows us to have very, very tightly, granularly enforced policy.
Love it. And step two is a natural extension. John just described, I love how you described the Kipling policy, which I think we talked about in step four, where we talk about policy, but you have to understand how the system works. I think in the OT environment, we find great complementary concepts with ISA 62443, the zones and conduits model, and how John mentioned the segmentation gateway, call it a policy enforcement point, call it what you want. You're describing conduits in an OT. They're fairly congruent concepts. So I think there's some really good mapping, and we really try to do a good job in the paper of drawing similarities between some well-known concepts and ways to secure critical infrastructure with the zero trust model, because zero trust didn't come out of the blue as a brand new thing. It built upon decades of what we've been doing, and it's just a simpler, more effective way of applying security. But understanding what you're trying to secure is key. Step two is understanding how things come and go. What's the dependency model? What's the data flow? What's the operational flow? John describes step two as map the transaction flows. I think in the paper we've slightly changed it to say map the operational flows as a nod to the operational community, slightly different vernacular. One can debate that's really a transaction. John, I like the way you described why transaction works in OT. Can you repeat that? We talked earlier about why it's just a transaction, call it operational flow, a transaction flow. Why is transactional flow still work in OT?
Because uh, these flows that connect with each other, they transact with each other. They're exchanging data. They're sending a message. They're doing something that is a transaction. And so that's how I've always thought of it, right? Because the goal is to get visibility here. And I guess it doesn't really matter whether you call it transaction flows or operational flows, except the prior art has always been transaction flows. But again, it gets into some of the nitpicking, especially in the OT world, where I think a lot of people are being dragged, kicking and screaming into the modernization of zero trust. They wish I would have never been born, and this whole thing would go away, and we could do it in the old way where there was no connectivity. And if only the internet wouldn't have been built, the life would be so much easier, right? And the if onlys. And so these are the things that are just crazy. So I I just, again, I'm a guy who likes to make things simple, so that if you want to call it operational flows, but really at the TCP/IP level, which is where this is all occurring, or at the protocol level, it's a transaction. So
Love that. Yeah, and you got to figure out how your systems work so that you can then figure out how to protect them. So step two is about figuring out how your systems work, the flows, map all the transaction flows
yeah,
around the protect surface that you've chosen. And step three is build the architecture, right? So that's design the zero trust architecture.
right.
John, to me, I always say, well, this is for the protect surface you've chosen. This is where you decide where you put your policy enforcement points. How would you describe step three, especially as it relates to OT?
Well, it's where you get the visibility to know, oh, I need a control here, right? So generic control of multiple types, but we can call it a policy enforcement point. The problem with policy enforcement point and policy decision point is that people get those two things confused, right? You just changed one letter. And so, there has to be some level of marketing going into this to get people to understand what's going on. So, uh, uh, what you're trying to do is say, by looking at the flow mapping, you go, oh, I see where the weakness is. I need to control here, here, and here. The first few times I did it, to me, it felt like magic, right? Because we were always told to start with a reference architecture and then build out from there. And we didn't even know why we were doing it. We didn't even know what we were protecting. And that's why that all failed. It's all failed. And so if you start with the thing you're protecting, then you have a better chance of protecting it because you know what it is. And so you're getting the insight into the protection of it by the flow mapping and then architecting. Every zero trust architecture or zero trust environment is custom made, tailor made, bespoke, if you will, for the protect surface.
I think that's such a huge clarifying point that's so relevant. Um, and John, how do you respond to critics of that approach to say, wait, so every single protect surface, I'm going to have a snowflake security design. How am I able to manage that? Because I agree, it should be tailored and fine-tuned to the protect surface. But how do you manage that when you've got thousands or hundreds of thousands of protect surfaces? You've got to have some control over all of those unique aspects of building that zero trust architecture.
Well, you manage it with automation, so it doesn't care. You're not doing it individually like the old days where one human being is managing one device. And so that's the crazy part. How do I put this? The management is not hard now. The management with platforms, you know, everything that's like this gets pushed this one policy, and it goes immediately to it. So it's all about, you know, computational automation that solves these problems for us. And these are the things that I think we need to understand is that it's very easy to manage compared to 15 years ago, or even 17 years ago when I started building the prototype environments, which were very difficult to manage. But this now, the stuff that I do, and at the company that I'm at, I mean, it's just like it's immediate. It's ubiquitous. I mean, it's really easy to manage these environments because there's a
Love
process,
that.
right? You're not doing it
Right.
one off.
Right. And you're using a technology available to us today. We can do this. You can still apply a unique zero trust architecture to a given protect surface, yet not lose the ability to manage that environment because of automation and all of the capabilities available to us.
Yeah,
Love that.
automation is key, right? You have to build
Yeah,
the machine that defeats the machine. And our adversary is highly automated, right?
that's
I
for sure.
mean, uh, attackers don't have change control, right? Think about it. And uh, I think that that's pretty interesting. That we can get out in front of them if we can automate.
Such a key concept. And so in working through into the step four, which is really where the rubber hits the road, this is really, even in the paper, we describe this as almost the first doing step. Steps one, two, and three are kind of an exercise in research and documentation. What are we going to protect? What are all the flows? What does the architecture look like? Okay, now let's start to apply policy. Now let's create the zero trust policy. Now let's use the Kipling method: who, what, when, where, why, and how to protect ourselves. And I think this is where, John, you talked about a unique bespoke zero trust architecture for each protect surface. This is where we start to implement the controls that are relevant to that protect surface. In step four, we create the policy. Is there any challenges or unique aspects that you've seen in creating a zero trust policy? And I'll jump to this other slide with the Kipling description. In OT environments specifically, have you found any differences in your work in applying policy creation, surprisings, challenges, anything in OT that you might be able to share with our audience here?
When 62443 was being written, and I was kind of advising them on the zero trust side of it, when I explained Kipling method to them, one of the authors said, "That's exactly what a conduit is, right there. That's a conduit. That's what we've been trying to say." It's like, this is amazing. So no, I haven't found it. I found a lot more people who go, oh, I see how I could use this.
Perfect.
So
That's great. Love the analogies. Yeah. So as folks are seeing this and hopefully reading the paper, hopefully you can see that there's a lot of concepts and history here to build on top of that can help inform your zero trust strategy. And zero trust strategy takes advantage of a lot of that and simplifies it so that you can get started right away. So great. Once we've got our policy, our final step, our step 5 is really, monitor and maintain. As John would call it, we've got to make sure what we've just built is effective. Did we do it right? John also talks about, and we have in the paper, we don't have it here in our presentation, but the zero trust learning curve in the paper, I think we call it crawl, walk, run. John's got a great diagram. John, you do the practice protect surface, the learning protect surface, like to get a few times doing this on some non-critical areas before you go for the crown jewels. This monitor and maintain to me is where those lessons manifest themselves. Would you agree? What is your intent of monitor and maintain in step 5 and any nuances in OT specifically for it?
well, monitor to maintain is how you make it better. And I've written recently about how step 5 is where we're going to use AI. So you take all the telemetry and you run it through AI analytics engines to see what you can do to make things better. And B, that it will end up moving us from beyond resilience to anti-fragility. So if you're not familiar with the concept of anti-fragility, there's a book by Nissim Nicholas Taleb called Anti-Fragile, and he gave me the vocabulary to talk about what I was trying to build, what I was trying to say in Zero Trust, which is let's create a system that gets better and better over time as it gets attacked. And he uses the example of a human body, right? You go out to Vegas. It's not true that everything that happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. All that extra weight that you put on comes back with you, right? And so, what do you have to do? Well, you have to stress your body out. You have to restrict calories. That's a stressor. You have to, exercise and work out, whether it's running or weightlifting or bicycling or swimming. That's a stressor. And he points out that your body, because it's an anti-fragile system, um, can adapt and respond and get stronger over time because of this property that he calls anti-fragility. And I have been noticing that this works in cybersecurity as well. The more visibility I have, the more information I have, I can refine my protect surfaces and get them more granular. I can see some things I missed in the transaction flows. I can realize that I need a control in a particular place that I didn't have it before. I can see that there's a policy that needs to be upgraded and make stronger. And then it becomes recursive. We do it again and again and again and again, and it's constant, right? And so these are the things that we're trying to do in step 5. Is resilience is kind of like we'll hold up the dam, but eventually there'll be too much water and it will break. But resilience, but anti-fragility is we're starting to see more water. We need to rebuild the dam earlier. We need to add more to the dam and constantly make the dam bigger, stronger, or take water out somewhere else or do something. And so it's a very helpful concept to understand how we can do this strategically. And I was just with a 3-star Air Force general, briefing him on Zero Trust, and I mentioned this concept. He said, "Oh, that book, Anti-Fragile, I love it." We get into this long diatribe, kind of off topic about the book Anti-Fragile, and everybody was looking at us like, "Whoa, that's kind of weird." But again, it resonated with him because he understood these higher level concepts that he wanted to see happen in his command.
What a great depiction of why step five is so important. I love that, John. Like you got to see it. You got to see the outcomes. You got to know where you're hurting to know what to stress and repair.
All right.
That's great. John, this has been great. Thank you so much for going through this. I do recommend folks read the paper. I would like to ask one more final question as part of our chat here, John. I feel like one of the keys to success of zero trust, and I'm sure you've seen this, is collaboration, cross-functional collaboration, and it's no more true in OT than doing this in IT, and perhaps even more important with the convergence of OT and IT. It kind of flies in the face of some separation of duties and a lot of regulatory compliance you encounter in critical infrastructure such as NERC SIP. Um, how do you marry the two? What's your any final thoughts to our audience members who might be saying, well, I have to comply with this regulatory compliance. I have to stay in my lane. I'm required to do that. But now you're telling me I got to collaborate with others to implement a zero trust strategy. How am I supposed to do this? Any final thoughts or words of wisdom there you can share?
You know, I guess because the collaboration we're talking about is the collaboration in the design process and getting a zero trust center of excellence built that has IT leaders, OT leaders, and business leaders together to define a set of objectives. I don't see how that is some sort of conflict of interest, right? I mean, the conflict of interest, you know, in the old days, the person who administered the firewall also audited the firewall. So if there was a problem, they just fixed it so that, you know, if there was a hack, I saw this all the time. If there was a hack and their firewall had been misconfigured, they changed it, and then they audited after they changed it, and then it was like, oh, no problem. You would see this.
Nothing
So
to
they
see
had to,
here.
nothing to see here. So go back to your homes and places of business. And so then people said, well, no, you have to have a different group audit it than does the work, right? Now, I'm not that much into NERC SIP anymore. It's been a long time since I've looked at that, so I'm not authoritative on that. But I can't see how, and no one has ever brought it up as an objection in any of the critical infrastructure things I've done, to create a center for excellence where information is shared as opposed to work, so that you can uh, all have a sense of being on the same page and all have a sense of that's the North Star, head that way.
Love that. Such great feedback. Thank you so much, John. Really appreciate your time and really appreciate your thought leadership and helping to change the industry here. Love what you've done and great to have you on our webinar here. Thanks so much.
Always a pleasure, Josh. Good to see you, my friend.
You too, John. Take care.